introduction to RUSI, who we are. So RUSI is the Royal United Services Institute for Defence and Security Studies, better known as RUSI for short. It is a completely independent UK think tank and UK charity as well, and we have an environmental crime portfolio of research led by our organised crime and policing team, which both myself and Anne-Marie sit under. My background is sort of more in kind of wildlife conservation and international wildlife trade. I've worked in sort of a number of different regions doing research, a little bit in South America and some in Africa as well. So yeah, that's me, and I'll let Anne-Marie introduce herself properly later on as well. So firstly, to turn to well, what is illegal wildlife trade? So this covers, multiple categories of crimes, including wildlife trafficking, illegal logging or timber trafficking, as it's sometimes referred to, and also illegal fishing. So you can broadly kind of think of it as sort of any illicit trade in any kind of wildlife commodity. But illegal wildlife trade is important to mention that it's one form of environmental crime. So the term environmental crime can also cover illegal mining and sort of pollution and waste crimes as well. But today we'll just be focusing sort of on the illegal wildlife trade and what that encompasses. So looking at the kind of global cost estimates of illegal wildlife trade, they sort of vary massively depending on the sort of studies and regions that you're looking at. But the United Nations Environment Programme describes it as the fourth largest global crime. So obviously quite significant there. And if you take just one of these cost estimates, the World Wildlife Foundation estimates that illegal wildlife trade is worth approximately 15 billion annually. So you can see there's huge amounts of money involved in this trade. And because of that, the huge profits kind of involved, it is certainly regarded by sort of the criminals involved in this trade as a high profit, sort of low risk endeavour. It's also often seen as a victimless crime because there's no sort of human victim involved. And because of these factors, it's also frequently exploited by organised crime syndicates as well. And that is obviously because of that relative sort of low risk and the lucrative profits, as you can see from the slide. Because of organised crime's involvement, there is also obviously a big intersection with other sort of crime types, other serious organised crime. So you get convergence with things like corruption, fraud, modern slavery, drugs, weapons, human trafficking, you name it. So we move now onto some of the sort of, the bigger sort of impacts of illegal wildlife trade. I mean, they are huge and far-reaching, and I won't go into all of them, but there's obviously a multitude of them. But you've got obviously the high-level ones like biodiversity loss, and resulting from that, you've got loss of ecosystem services. So things like water. You've also got an impact on food security. So lots of indigenous communities rely on subsistence hunting, but if those species are being traded on the international market, they're not there for the locals to use. You've also got impacts on local livelihoods. So lots of economies rely on natural resources and also rely on tourism associated with wildlife as well. But there are also impacts for things like human health. You've obviously got the risk of zoonotic disease transfer. Illegal wildlife trade has been linked to SARS, Ebola, swine flu, and even COVID-19. Got the risk, obviously, of species extinction, which is a big one. But there's also impacts, obviously, on climate change as well. So you've got, obviously, illegal logging precipitates soil erosion, and it also releases carbon into the atmosphere, and also, obviously, destroys the sort of forest resources there as well. And if you see from this slide, all of this sort of has big, over time has big implications for national security as well. So to look now at a few of the sort of key enablers, there's an array of enablers of illegal wildlife trade, and I won't have time to sort of go into them all. But globally, corruption and regulation gaps are perceived to be the major ones. And I think Anne-Marie is going to go into corruption in a little more detail later on, so I won't go into too much there. But these are sort of some others on the slide to be aware of, and particularly in the context of African wildlife, the presence of high value commodities and global trends are important there. To turn now to the illegal wildlife trade supply chain pyramid. So looking at some of the sort of actors involved and how they relate to one another. You've got the extractors and transporters at the bottom of this pyramid. So these will include individuals like loggers, wildlife poachers, and fishers, for example. Then you've got the intermediaries and corrupt officials at the centre. So these will be your brokers, middlemen, processors, traders, for example. And then you've got the heads of the organised criminal syndicates at the top. And these are obviously the ones that profit the most from illegal wildlife trade. And it's important to understand that as you move down this pyramid, the risk increases. So the bosses rarely get their hands dirty, and the highest risk lies very much with the poachers actually, harvesting sort of illegal wildlife. And the profits do exactly the opposite. So in Tanzania, for example, a local exporter of elephant ivory might achieve sort of $250 per kilo. In China, it will sell for over double that per kilo. But the poacher who's actually on the ground taking the highest risk will see only a very small proportion of those kind of profits. And also with these actors, it's probably important to mention that they're not necessarily tied to specific locations. Some of these actors are operating transnationally as well. So if we turn now to look at some of the species traded, it's also important, I think, to mention here that these species are not always traded in their kind of raw, full form. In illegal wildlife trade, you often find illegal trading kind of parts or derivatives as well. And also the products are sometimes sort of processed and consolidated sort of during the trafficking process. But I'm going to look at a few different species today, but just to try and give you a bit of a snapshot. Obviously, it's not going to cover all of them, but yeah, we'll go through a few and hopefully give you some insights. The focus sort of, I think, in sort of the public view of illegal wildlife trade has tended to focus on sort of charismatic species, we call them. So this will be, the species, as you can see here, like the elephant, the rhino, and the pangolin. And these are still heavily targeted, so they obviously are still very, very, very important ones to consider. And in the case of elephant ivory, their ivory is targeted for carvings and for jewelry. Rhino horn is traditionally sort of targeted for traditional Chinese medicine, and the pangolin is targeted for food and also traditional Chinese medicine as well. But beyond these kind of charismatic species, there are also trade in other sort of less charismatic species of fauna, and also in species of flora as well. So we'll look at a few examples of these now. So these are succulents, and succulents have experienced a huge surge in popularity recently. And this is largely due to collectors wanting to have like the rarest and the most exotic specimens within their collection at home. And this occurs sort of all over the world. But because of this popularity, they're being targeted by organised crime all over the world, wherever they can be sort of sourced. But recently this trend has been impacting the rare desert species in Africa. So police in South Africa, for example, have been confiscating huge shipments of succulents that are destined for Asia. And then you've also got a species of cycads as well, which are sort of one of the lesser known ones affected by illegal wildlife trade. There are species of plant that have been targeted for poachers for quite some time. They are often confused with palms, but given their rarity in the wild, they fetch a much, much higher price than palms do. And they're sought after both domestically by collectors in Africa for their private, horticultural collections, but also for the international market as well. And because of this trade and the length of time that it's been going on, many species of the cycads are now extinct in the wild due to the trade. And now if we look at some of the less charismatic species of fauna as well. So these are sea cucumbers, which I certainly wasn't aware of until I started studying illegal wildlife trade and scuba diving as well, but they're quite an interesting creature. They're members of the starfish family, and there's no local market for them in Africa as far as I'm aware. So they are, poached almost, entirely for the market in China. So they're a valuable commodity in China as both a culinary delicacy, so they eat them there, and also as a medicinal ingredient for their traditional Chinese medicine as well. And so, the abalone is also targeted for similar reasons, and because of this, it's recognised as the world's most valuable shellfish. So this is largely, again, due to demand in China, and due to this demand, they are threatened with extinction in Africa as well. So, and if we look now to rosewood, so rosewood is a species of tree that's also heavily targeted by the illegal wildlife trade. As a result of the pressure from illegal wildlife trade, it has all 300 species are now protected by international trade regulations. However, it's still reportedly the world's most trafficked wildlife product, and it's found across many regions of Africa. And lastly, to the African grey parrot, it's been a popular exotic pet for many years. And there's now a total ban on the international trade of these parrots. But however, largely due to the fact that they're still popular as pets, and this has been sort of perpetuated by popularity on the internet, they are still frequently illegally harvested from the wild for the illegal pet trade. And we'll look at the role of the internet a little bit more in a second as well. So if we turn now to the trafficking routes that are involved in the illegal wildlife trade, I mean, jurisdictions play multiple roles in relation to global kind of illegal wildlife trade activity. So jurisdictions might be a source country, for example, where the point of poaching or harvesting actually occurs. Countries might also be, or there might be a consolidation point. So that's where quantities are sort of brought together to form a kind of larger consignment of illegal wildlife trade goods. They might be a transit point as well, so that's where the product will pass through one point and onwards to the final destination. Or they might be a demand country, so where the final sale usually occurs. And these demand countries play a really important role in illegal wildlife trade, as we'll look at next. So this is a study that was conducted by EIA, and it was just documenting the trafficking routes of elephant ivory, pangolin, rhino and tiger products coming out of Africa. So there's, you can see a general trend of the wildlife being sourced in Africa, moving through certain transit points, and then being transported largely to sort of China and Southeast Asia. And that is obviously reflective of where that demand is for those products. So you see those final destination countries there. And if we turn to look at the pangolin, which is a really interesting case study in terms of when it comes to look at the sort of role that demand plays in illegal wildlife trade. Pangolins are highly sought after in China for their scales. There's a legal market in China for them. So whilst international trade is heavily restricted, there is a legal market and you are domestically allowed to have them in China. So initially this kind of demand was met by sourcing the Asian species of pangolin, which we'll see on the slide there. There's four different species of Asian pangolin. However, due to these trade pressures for the illegal wildlife trade, the Asian pangolins are now very, very few in number. And as a result, China's demands have now turned obviously towards the African species, hence the trade coming out of Africa now. In terms of sort of broader kind of trafficking routes, you'll see similar trends with illegal timber. So this is again going back to the EIA report. And you'll see sort of similar trade flows to the map before, with illegal timber coming out of Africa and flowing towards Asia. But I should stress here that illegal timber trade is not a problem unique to Africa. A huge amount also occurs in other forest-rich countries. So, for example, South America, you'll see similar sort of flows to demand countries as well. So, but this is just one particular study looking at Africa. And looking back to that sort of exotic pets and the role kind of social media can play in determining the sort of routes that commodities are trafficked, and also the demand for certain species. Looking just as an example of the cheetahs here, there's a huge demand for exotic pets like cheetahs in the United Arab Emirates, and this is largely due to social media posts. So you'll see here, obviously, this is one taken from social media of a cheetah as a passenger in a car. But these sort of social media posts which are making them more popular, there's also a lot of trade happening on these social media platforms as well. So you've got an example here of a cheetah being sold, I think, openly on Facebook in the United Arab Emirates. But obviously they're not native to the United Arab Emirates, so where do these cheetahs come from? Their natural habitat is Africa. So you can see here from this again study, this is from GTOC, did a study recently on the cheetahs, and you'll see here that organised crime groups are trafficking the animals sort of out of kind of the Horn of Africa through multiple transit points, and ultimately to the United Arab Emirates or sometimes Russia, and other sort of destinations where they're popular as exotic pets. But you also get organised crime groups alongside these kind of trafficking routes are also laundering them through corrupt breeding facilities across Africa as well. And that's not a thing unique to the cheetahs, but this is just one example of the trafficking routes. But as I say, they're not. We can't present everything here today, but these hopefully give you an idea of some of the species that are involved and some of the trafficking routes and the sort of general trends involved in illegal wildlife trade.